Brazil joins the US in government led online censorship, and Elon Musk says he's not having it. On this episode, we're going to talk about what's going on down in Brazil, what's going on in the US, and what we should do about it, and how we really need a digital Bill of Rights. You're not going to want to miss it, so make sure you stick around until the end. Let's get into it. Welcome to Cutting Edge Faith. I'm Ryan Howard. This podcast is here to help you understand the times, stand for truth, and grow in your faith. Well, we've got quite the news coming out here in just the last couple of days, and that is big tech censorship. And of course, that is nothing new. We truth tellers have been coming up with ways to circumvent the censorship that's been happening and the viewpoint discrimination and all that sort of stuff. And we know that even government involvement in censorship maybe is not anything that's new, because we see what China does in the CCP and how they completely control the narrative. It is only state controlled media in China. In fact, I interviewed Kay Rubicek, who talked about what really happens in China and how all their journalists go through training and what's really going on there, and how there's a certain narrative. It's just really just a propaganda arm of the government. Now, that's not surprising because we already know about that, and we sort of expect that with a communist regime in charge of a country. But what we don't expect is what's been revealed here lately, which is the government involvement and government coercion of media in the West. That's exactly what we have. Now, the Twitter files of Brazil were recently released, and I'll put a link to those in the show notes if you haven't seen them yet. But it just shows how far reaching the censorship has gone and pressuring the different companies from the Brazilian Supreme Court. And I even wrote an article back in 2020 about the Brazilian presidential election on Charisma. I'll put that in the show notes as well. But the Twitter files allege and show that Google, Facebook, Uber, Instagram, and WhatsApp have all given into Brazilian government demands to provide user registration data and other information. And so that's very disappointing, perhaps not even surprising, though. But X, or Twitter, leadership elected to take a different approach. And Elon has even publicly committed to exposing everything. In fact, he said, coming shortly, X will publish everything demanded by Alexandre. That's the leader of the Supreme Court in Brazil. It says, we'll publish everything demanded by Alexandre and how those requests violate Brazilian law. This judge has brazenly and repeatedly betrayed the Constitution and people of Brazil. He should resign or be impeached. Shame, Alexandre, shame. Now, this is something that has come to Brazil, and it's something that we had in the U.S. as well. And Tucker Carlson did an interview with Mike Benz and talked about that. But this tech censorship in Brazil took place, like I said, back even to the 2020 election. This is really just the next link in the chain. I mean, we saw what happened during COVID-19, where the government wanted a narrative out there. The administrators of the government wanted a narrative. The administrative state around the world, but especially in the US, wanted a particular narrative protected, and all other narratives shot down. And we saw that very clearly during COVID. And many of us had our eyes opened before COVID. And so when COVID came, it was just like we saw it coming miles away. And so we just saw further evidence of that, though, in a Tucker Carlson interview. Mike Benz was on his program, and Mike is a former State Department official. And in their interview, they discussed the aggressive censorship of the online discourse around mail-in voting during the 2020 U.S. election. Now, you may not be surprised by that, but it was actually government coerced and government forced. And he talked about how the Department of Homeland Security coerced social media companies through formal partnership and coordination mechanisms. And they categorized any discourse online that questioned mail-in voting as a cyber attack. That's right. And that must be censored. And so by doing that, then the Department of Homeland Security could come in. And so they got real creative in how they could do that. And so then they went and forced these companies to do that. And unfortunately, they capitulated. And they also talked about how this concept of narrative mapping, and it basically gives them, the government, access to all the discussions happening around different parts of the world on what's trending. And they had something, where they can mass removal of the things that they don't want being talked about and trending. And there was something they also discussed called the Virality Project, which actually mapped 66 different narratives around COVID-19. And that was all with the goal of removing the narratives that the government did not want. So that's pretty clear. But when did this all begin? Well, It began, not surprisingly, under the Obama administration. That's right. There was a formal government censorship operation that was put in place under the Obama administration to partner with technology platforms. And at that time, of course, they used the threat of ISIS recruiting. That was the justification that they used. ISIS is recruiting on social media. So, got to have some government coercion there, got to have some government working with them for that to use this intelligence. Now, of course, that evolved and developed into something more than that. These highly coordinated, government driven efforts are a clear violation of our God-given rights. Our God-given rights don't only sit in the physical realm and in the person-to-person freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It also is in the digital world. We're going to get into that in just a second here. But I want to go on a little rant here about Section 230. One of the things that we talked about a lot, and we talked about on this show, is Section 230 of the Communications Act. And this basically includes federal immunity that is applied to media companies and who are platforms, and it does not apply to publishers. So like the New York Times or this podcast or whatever, we can't just go around slandering, saying things that are not true, because somebody could bring a lawsuit against us, and so we don't want to do that. And the New York Times needs to be careful about that. And that's another topic. But you can see the Sections 230 Communication Act would apply to like an internet company or like a telephone company, things that are happening on their platform that may not be acceptable or legal, but they're not necessarily responsible for it. That's an immunity that they have, a protection under the law. And we say, hey, there's this carve out that's being applied to social media companies who are platforms, but they're acting like publishers because they're doing editorial reviews of what can be allowed to be on the platform and what cannot be. So they should not be allowed to do that, because if they can do that, then they can just remove whoever they want. They can demonetize whoever they want. And there's no recourse, no legal recourse that someone could take against them for a wrongful deplatforming. Okay. And so that's a problem. And until recently, we were just ripping on these companies like, oh, it's just the companies have these politicians in their back pocket, and that's why they're not closing these loopholes. But now we see more clearly that the government doesn't want these loopholes closed, because they can use these companies to do what the government can't do constitutionally in the US and Brazil. So what do? They force them, and they use coercion and all of these efforts, like I've talked about. And this is the tip of the iceberg. I mean, I'll put some links in there. You can do all this research, more research if you want. But you can see these government bad actors are doing this for their own interest. And of course, they're coercing. Now, I'm not saying that the social media companies are clean. Of course, they've got their own leftist, wacky viewpoints and narratives that they're pushing. But this government led coercion is just another rung in the ladder. It's another thing driving it. So, what do we need to do? Well, I mentioned a digital bill of rights. And the fact is that our God given rights, like I said, are not limited to the physical realm where we own property and where we talk to each other freely and where we practice and freedom of religion freely. Okay. That's not only in the physical realm, it's also in the online realm, in the digital realm. And so what we need is a digital bill of rights. And so what would that look like? You say, what would that look like? Well, it would be very similar to physical property rights. So let's go through a few of those. Ownership, the right to possess property, includes both digital and physical property. Use, the right to use and enjoy both physical and digital property. These are all property rights. This is literally pulled from property rights, and I'm adding this to digital because it's the same. We have disposition. So that's the right to sell, transfer, dispose of, delete physical and digital property. So get rid of it. Want to get rid of it? Don't want to get rid of it? You have that right. Exclusion and privacy. So the right to prevent others from using or interfering with physical and digital property without the owner's permission. Look, interesting, because all these free platforms are selling your data. They're selling our data. And now we're starting to see some things come into place where it just looks like they're starting to address that, but not really. We need a digital bill of rights. That's what we need. And so that privacy can be in place. And then they need to have the owner's permission. Protection from expropriation. The right to be protected from government seizing or expropriating property without due process. That includes both digital and physical. So government, like the example we're talking about here, forcing the shutdown of accounts. That's what happened in Brazil. That's what's happened in the US. Deplatforming. And the government shouldn't be able to do that without due process, because we have rights. We have digital rights and we have physical rights. All of these things are in the same realm of God-given rights. So these digital rights, among others, I mean, there's others that we could talk about as well, but are from God. And the government's job is to protect those rights. The government's not granting us those rights. The government's job is to protect those rights. And when they don't protect them, that is a dereliction of duty. So all governing authorities ultimately are under God's authority. And so we, as Christ followers and as citizens, need to be informed. You need this. We need to have this information. And we need to continue to lead the push to have biblical governance happening in our nation. And in the US, in Brazil, and wherever you might be living, we need to continue to push that way. And we need to hold our elected officials accountable. And we need to be involved. When I ran for the Iowa House in 2020, I learned that only 10% of people are considered high information voters. Most 90% of people don't really know the details of what's going on. They don't really pay attention. They may hear the headlines, but in their day-to-day life, they don't really know what's going on. And that means rights are eroded from under their feet. They just don't even know what's going on. They can be taken advantage of. They can believe all these crazy narratives. But we need to not only be tuned into what's going on, but we need to be tuned into the Holy Spirit. We need to be having the Lord leading us, giving us discernment every single day. You wake up, you meet with the Lord, and then you walk spirit-led throughout the day. And you need to have we need to have a consecrated lifestyle set apart, because time's coming, and it's really already here, where natural understanding is not going to be enough. You're going to need supernatural discernment. You're going to need to be tuned into the Holy Spirit, and be willing to make a sacrifice. Be willing to count the cost. Be willing to hold what God gives you in an open hand. And one way that I want to invite you to activate your faith, to take your faith to the next level, is to get my free email course. It's howtogrowyourfaith.com. Go to howtogrowyourfaith.com. You can get my free email course. You're going to get the 5 biggest mistakes that Christians are making today. And that's going to launch you into some habits and routines and things to have in place for you to live spirit-led, to walk with the discernment of the Holy Spirit every single moment of every single day, and to have that lifestyle that God created you to have, to be prepared to understand that God's not wasting anything, that he will use everything for your good. That is, if you know Jesus Christ. That is step number 1. Nothing else matters without that. That is the truth. If you're watching the video, would you like and subscribe? And would you share this with a friend? You can go to ryanshoward.com to find out more about everything we have going on. Thank you so much for joining. God bless, and we'll see you in the next episode.